Mr. Conaway.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise today in support of H.R. 238, the Commodity End User Relief Act. The Commodity End User Relief Act is a bipartisan bill to reauthorize the Commodity Futures Trading Commission to make much-needed regulatory reforms and, most importantly, to make statutory changes to protect end users and give them access to the tools they need to manage their risks. Over the past 4 years, the House Committee on Agriculture has held almost 24 hearings examining the Commission and investigating the impacts of the Dodd-Frank Act on our derivatives markets. Our witnesses, many of whom are market participants struggling to comply with the burdensome rules and ambiguous portions of the underlying statute, were consistent in their call for relief. To address their concerns, H.R. 238 makes reforms that fall into three broad categories: customer protections, commission reforms, and end-user relief. Title I of the bill protects customers and margin funds they deposit at their futures commission merchants by codifying critical changes made during the collapse and bankruptcies of MF Global and Paragon Financial. Title II makes meaningful reforms to the operations of the Commission to improve the agency's deliberative process. In doing so, it also requires the Commission to conduct more thorough and robust cost-benefit analysis to help get future rulemakings right the first time. While the CFTC is already required to consider costs and benefits of the rules it proposes, its work has been called into question by the CFTC Inspector General, who reported the Commission and staff seem to view the process more of a legal one than an economic one. End users are the businesses that provide Americans with food, clothing, transportation, energy, heat, and much more. Companies that produce, consume, and transport the commodities that make modern life possible use futures and swaps markets to reduce the uncertainty of the businesses they face. Farmers hedge their crop in the spring so they'll know what they'll get paid in fall. Utilities hedge the price of energy so they can charge customers at a steady rate. Manufacturers hedge the cost of steel and energy and other inputs to lock in prices as they fill orders. The fact is, no end user played any part of the financial crisis, and no end user currently poses a systemic risk to the U.S. derivative markets. Yet, as the Agriculture Committee heard in countless hours of testimony, today it is more difficult and more expensive for them to manage their risks than it was for them 5 years ago. Some of these challenges are the result of ambiguities and oversight in the text of the Commodities Exchange Act, and some of them result from overzealous rulemakings by the Commission itself. Today's legislation fixes statutory problems like Section 304, which amends the definition of financial entity to ensure that some end users don't lose their clearing exemption simply because a hedging strategy makes up for losses in a physical transaction. Or like Section 315, which makes small changes to the swap's core principles to align them with the conventions in the swaps industry rather than the futures industry, easing compliance burdens for those newly regulated entities. It also fixes problems that have grown out of the CFTC's own rulemakings. For example, Section 308 sets aside a Commission rule that would automatically lower the transaction threshold, triggering registration as a swap dealer. This costly, complex registration process was intended for large financial institutions. But because this registration threshold was set arbitrarily, it has swept up some commodity firms as well. If the limits fall by 60% next year, it could sweep up 100 more firms into the reach of Dodd-Frank. While H.R. 238 would fix the level at its current $8 billion level, unless the Commission proposes a new rule with evidence of the needed reduction. Similarly, Section 313 exempts religious pension plans and university endowments from a new rule requiring them to register as commodity pool operators simply because they use standardized hedging products. What H.R. 238 does not do is roll back a single core tenet of Title VII of Dodd-Frank. It does not change the execution, clearing, margining, capital, or reporting framework set up by that act. In fact, not a single witness who appeared before the House Committee on Agriculture ever asked us to fundamentally upend these principles. These are concepts that have been a part of swaps markets long before the financial reform happened. The committee, the Commission, and the industry will continue to grapple with the details of these core tenets, seeking to provide the right mix of flexibility and oversight. Before I close, I would like to thank members of the Ag Committee who sat through all these hearings and all the markups on this issue. Chairman Austin Scott and Ranking Member David Scott, two of my co-sponsors on this legislation, have led most of the committee's hearings on these issues, and they've done great work. Together, we put forward a bipartisan bill that makes narrowly targeted changes to provide relief from regulatory burdens on American businesses. The Commodity End User Relief Act offers meaningful improvements for market participants without undermining the basic goals of Title VII of Dodd-Frank, and it does so by providing the right relief to the right people. With that, I urge support of the Commodity End User Relief Act with all its amendments and in submitting to the record letters of support from over 30 groups.